Great. I hope everyone is excited for another Wednesday webinar here from KKC. So today's webinar is about estate planning for parents with college-age kids. So a little bit of what we're going to discuss today is about planning for you as the parents. But what the bulk of the conversation will be about today is actually some planning that takes place at the level of your child. So some documents that make sense possibly for them to sign. So we'll be covering both aspects of that today. I know I started just a tad early today, so we're going to give folks a couple more minutes to sign on in case folks are running a few minutes behind today. So I'll start by saying that we do have another webinar coming up. It's not going to be next week in light of the holiday. Actually, we're taking a little bit of a break. So our webinars will be back on December 8th. And our December 8th webinar is going to be, again, on an estate planning topic. And it's about some tips and kind of things you should be aware of as year-end approaches. Maybe I call it kind of what you need to know about year-end estate planning. Discussing some potential changes that might go into effect next year, just some generic tips that you should be looking at kind of every year end when you're reevaluating your estate plan. So that's going to be coming up again on December 8th. If you have any interest, please feel free to register for that webinar. But then otherwise, I think that I'm not sure if we have any other webinars scheduled for the rest of the year at this point. I know we have a very robust schedule coming up for next year, so please stay tuned and keep an eye on our website as we'll be posting all of that information there. So in interest of time, I think it's 12:01 now, so we'll get started. So as I mentioned, today's topic is on estate planning for parents with college-age kids. The very biggest takeaway is that 18-year-olds are no longer kids in the eyes of the law. So I know as parents, you look at your 18-year-old and say they still need a lot of help. I'm still involved in a lot of the daily aspects of their lives. But again, as far as the rest of the world is concerned, an 18-year-old kid is now really an adult. What that means for you is that you're not going to have, as soon as they hit that 18th birthday, you're not even going to have the same level of access that you've had up until this point. So the big ones being, if your kid goes off to college or anywhere else, no one is going to share in there. And I'll stick with the college for a moment. If your kid goes off to college, school is not going to be sending you automatically copies of their grades or providing you with any information. A lot of that communication is going to go directly to your 18-year-old just because, again, they're the legal adults here. So you don't automatically have that access that you had previously when your kid was considered a minor and you were the legal guardian. So there's going to be kind of a cutoff of access to information, which can be a really big issue. I mean, college is a really big adjustment for a lot of kids. It can also be something as simple as being able to have access to your kids' grades and any other correspondence with the school. I mean, that's going to keep you kind of up to date, maybe with what's going on with your child, even if it's not something necessarily that they're telling you directly. It can be a way for you to kind of keep tabs to make sure there's not some larger underlying issues, just general difficulties with adjusting to that new environment. Maybe, God forbid, mental health issues or other maybe substance abuse problems. Slipping grades can be a really big indicator of a lot of those types of things. So not to sound overly doom and gloom, but just being able to have access and kind of keep tabs on your kids may tip you off to some larger issues that may be there. And also for a lot of parents, you're footing the bill, maybe wholly or partially in terms of tuition. So to just be able to be involved again in that communication with the school too, you're probably going to want to have. So again, but you're not necessarily going to be able just to automatically get that anymore because your 18-year-old kid is really going to be the point person for a lot of those communications in the eyes of the school. Also, from a medical perspective, again, as a legal adult, your child now is the one that makes all of their medical decisions. So you're not automatically going to be able to call and speak with their doctors or to be able to sit in on doctor's appointments anymore with your kids. So again, that's the overall takeaway. And I apologize for being redundant and saying it several times, but I think it merits kind of bringing that point home is that the automatic access that you used to have with your kids prior to them turning 18, to a large degree, that valve turns off the second they turn 18. So to be aware of that is good. And also know that there's things you can do that will allow you to continue to have that involvement in their child's life. And from a legal perspective, that means having your child sign over some documents that's going to give you that access. Again, assuming that your child's okay with it, because it is something they're going to have to be in agreement with. But assuming everybody agrees, it's something that's going to be really beneficial for you as a parent to have that continued access, to still be able to help your kids with certain decisions that they may just not have the experience to deal with on their own yet. So the first document that we recommend is a power of attorney. And I know a lot of folks, when thinking about powers of attorney, maybe you've executed one with your own estate plan. You're thinking it makes sense for, as you get older, you need help with paying your bills and managing your finances. That's really what the power of attorney is for. And that's true. That's an area where we definitely see a lot of power of attorney usage. But the power of attorney, generally speaking, its whole purpose is to grant someone else authority to access your financial information and legal information. So the one we typically recommend, again, in the case with a parents with a kids going off to college, or again, just kids turning 18, is have your kids sign over a power of attorney to you, or maybe you and your spouse, or both parents, to allow you to be that legal decision maker for your kid if they need help. If you want to be able to call the school and talk with them about your kid's grades, if you want to be able to help your kid, just even kind of general financial stuff. Maybe your kid now has a job and is earning some type of income. Do they know how to set up a bank account and balance their checkbook and make sure that they know if they need to file their taxes every year? Having a power of attorney that your child has granted to you is going to give you that one, access to that information. So you'll be able to know and kind of keep aware, apprised of everything that's going on. And two, it's going to allow you to actually make decisions on behalf of your kid. So if your kid either can't because they're not physically there, or for whatever reason unable to do these types of things for themselves, you can just, by virtue of having the power of attorney, do those types of things on your child's behalf. So again, it's going to help you in terms of allowing access to financial and legal information. People will disclose that type of information to you, and being able to wholeheartedly just kind of step in and help your kids out when they need that assistance. The second document that's also going to help, and actually I should say the next two documents, because they kind of work in conjunction with each other, is more on the healthcare side of things. Your 18-year-old, as I mentioned, now is the adult. So when it comes to doctor's appointments, the doctors are talking to your kid, and they're asking your kid to fill out forms and make decisions about what needs to be done, and discussing things that may be done in the past and talking about plans for the future. So you're not necessarily, again, going to be the point person sitting in that appointment with your kid talking to the doctor, or you won't even have the ability to make those types of decisions absent your child giving you that access. And the way you do that is twofold. Again, with the two documents that I had briefly mentioned before, it's the healthcare directive and it's a HIPAA waiver. The HIPAA waiver is kind of your entry point, because HIPAA, which is an acronym, it stands for Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. It's legislation that was implemented years ago that was designed to protect your confidential medical information. Doctors are not allowed to disclose your protected medical information to anyone specifically without your specific consent. That's why you'll notice every single time you even go into a doctor's office for an appointment, and that's your primary care, that's your dentist, that's any type of medical professional, probably every time you walk in the door, they have you sign a HIPAA release that says you authorize your doctors to be able to release information to certain folks. And a lot of times, maybe it's to be able to release information to your insurance company to submit a claim, but also too, I know when I go to the doctors myself, they also say, are we allowed to leave messages for anyone other than you? Are we allowed to talk to anyone else if they call our office? And specifically, who are those people? So that's the HIPAA waiver. They want you to authorize them. Again, assuming you want other folks to have access, the HIPAA form is the people that you authorize to be able to have access to that information. So having your child sign over a HIPAA waiver that says you have access to their healthcare information, again, it's going to allow you that level of access. One, to be able to talk to their doctors, or two, if they're away at school or living somewhere else, and again, it's the physician at the school, you'll be able to communicate with them directly to say, how is my kid? Is anything going wrong with them? Or I know they have these conditions. Can you disclose any information to me? Again, that HIPAA waiver is going to allow you to have that access and be able to talk frankly with your child's medical providers. The second document is the healthcare directive. And the healthcare directive is kind of akin to the power of attorney, but on the medical side. So the healthcare directive says your child appoints you, or again, maybe you and their other parent, to be medical decision makers for them if they're unable to make any type of medical decisions for themselves. And also too, something to keep in mind with both the power of attorney and the healthcare directive, I've indicated that it can be an appointment of you or you and your child's other parent, whether that be your spouse or otherwise. But something to consider too, that if everybody gets along, that tends to work out well. But if there's disagreement, namely between you and your child's other parent, about what should be done, what medical treatments does your child need? Again, it's assuming your child can't communicate their wishes about those types of things for themselves, or what type of financial transactions they should enter, and what type of, again, anything on the financial side, what needs to be done. If there's disagreement there, or if you think there's maybe the potential for disagreement there, it would make sense that your child maybe not necessarily appoint you and their other parent to serve in that role together as kind of co-agents. It might make more sense to choose one spokesperson for the group. So choose one of you as the primary agent, maybe, and then the other parent as the backup. So that way you're both appointed in succession, but simply having one point person can avoid disputes like that might slow things down when maybe it's kind of an emergency situation. So something definitely to consider. I know this is a really big consideration, especially for folks where, again, it's maybe you and your child's other biological parent aren't married, there's a divorce, or maybe you're remarried. If there's other considerations like that at play, or you know what, even if you and your child's other parent are together, but you just have really strong opinions on different sides of the spectrum, again, all the more reason to kind of think about that, go through that analysis to figure out, one, if you both agree, yes, we should have our child sign these documents over to you, I should say, great, but give careful consideration is exactly how you and your child's other parent should be appointed. So to kind of circle back again, so that appointing for under the healthcare directive, your child will appoint you or their other parent, again, however you want to structure that, however you deem most appropriate, to be able to have that access, to be able to make medical decisions on your child's behalf. To kind of give you some examples that I've actually heard from some of my clients over the years, of kind of situations that they've run into because they didn't have these types of documents in place. Number one is always I'm paying my kids tuition and I don't even get to see what their grades are. That sticks in a lot of people's craws, and understandably so. So all the more reason, again, the power of attorney is going to be a good idea for you to be able to have access to that type of information. And the second one being on the medical side, I had a client who I don't think it was their child. I think it was the roommate of their child who went off to college out of state. The roommate was out skateboarding, fell, broke his arm, ended up in the hospital. Parents, again, who were located here, and again, I forget what other state it was, but it was outside of Connecticut. The parents called the hospital and said, we want to tell us what's going on with our son. What happened? What are you guys doing? And basically the doctor said, we can't talk to you. We can't provide you with any information because we don't have a HIPAA release. You're not an authorized healthcare representative under a healthcare directive to be able to make any type of decisions on your son's behalf. And so the parents were really stonewalled and didn't have any access to the information until they had to go into the emergency room to this 18-year-old who was in a lot of pain because he just broke his arm. And to have him to shove a form under his nose, say, this is a HIPAA waiver form. Do you authorize us to be able to speak with your parents, and kind of coordinate all that, making sure everybody gets it. And then having, again, them now the parents being able to call back and confirm, do you have this information on file? Can you speak to us now? I mean, it ended up being, from what I was told, a very long process simply for parents to be able to call in a hospital and say, what's happening with our son? So that's a situation, again, you definitely want to avoid. A second situation that I've actually heard too, which is not so emergency, but it almost made me chuckle, is kind of, again, understanding that when you turn 18, that the kids are now legal adults, but the situation, the result of that was somewhat ludicrous in that my client took her son again to his regular physical at their primary care doctor's office that they've been going to for years and years and years. And mom was used to kind of walking in the room, sitting down, talking to the doctor. And this time they said, nope, you essentially they've made her sit in the waiting room and wouldn't allow her to fill out any forms or talk to the doctors. Within 5 minutes of her son going into the examination room, they came out and got mom again to come back into the room because son was being asked to fill out forms and he had no idea who his insurance carrier was or any of his insurance information. He didn't even know what his social security number was. And so he was just completely overwhelmed. Again, here's an 18-year-old kid that's had mom and dad doing this stuff for him his whole life, but all of a sudden he just turned 18 and was in the position of having to do all this alone, and he couldn't. So that actually, again, worked out fairly simply where son was able to authorize mom to be able to have access to that information kind of on the spot, allow doctors to be able to speak with her. But again, something as simple that's easy, something easy to coordinate there. But the last thing, again, you want to have is some kind of emergency situation where you're at your child is at a doctor's office or at a hospital where you're not there and they don't know you. And then you're not being able to have access to them or even be able to talk to the doctor. So simply having these types of documents in place can avoid a lot of those types of situations. Another thing that can be done, and this is not necessarily on preparation on my end of preparing any type of legal documents, but something to definitely consider is insurance. As morbid as it might sound, getting insurance on your child's life for life insurance or for their disability. A big reason why this can become important for a lot of folks is if something happens to your child and God forbid they pass away, and they still signed on to these college loans and you co-signed onto these college loans, you still have the ongoing responsibility to repay those loans potentially. That's not necessarily going to evaporate if your child passes away. So if you have now all of a sudden these massive student loans that you're on the hook for, that might be something where, again, it might make sense to get a life insurance policy out on your child. So God forbid that happens. Again, you're not assuming an enormous financial burden. All of a sudden, you're going to have some life insurance proceeds to blunt the impact of that. Then there's kind of the same analysis too for if your child becomes disabled. If again, you've co-signed on to all these loans or other financial obligations with your child, and now all of a sudden they're disabled, unable to work, and don't have any income of their own to pay for these expenses. Again, if you're the co-signer there, you now all of a sudden are taking over that responsibility. So having proper insurance in place, again, can provide you security for those instances. So you're not going to totally have to upend your own financial well-being because you're now all of a sudden going to be saddled with these other financial obligations. There's also some continued benefit to having these life insurance policies in place. Even after, as your child grows older, they graduate from college, maybe pay off their student loans. What you can do is you can also at some point transfer these policies over to your child. And now it's a benefit for them. So they can have that life insurance policy again, continue on their life and say, well, now it's not necessarily in terms of making sure college loans are paid off, but I have a mortgage. I have a car loan. I have my own kids now to provide them with some type of financial security after I pass away. Maybe that's a really great gift you can give them. Here's this policy that you've already obtained on them. You just turn it over to them and they get to now name who the beneficiaries are going to be under that policy, again, to provide security for their own family and for their own potential financial obligations that they might be assuming. So that might be a really great gift you can give to your kid in terms of setting them up for the future. Also, too, setting up policies or getting a policy on an 18-year-old or a younger adult, as you might imagine, assuming there's no underlying health issues, insurance for young, healthy people is really inexpensive. There's going to be differences depending on whether you're looking at whole life policies, which, again, as the name implies, are tended to be around for the insured person's entire life, or term policies where you're saying you only want a policy in place to cover 10, 20, 25 years, whatever it is. There's going to be some differences in terms of premiums depending on which policy you choose. But generally speaking, if you're looking to get a policy on your 18-year-old child, chances are it's going to be really inexpensive. So having those policies in place, and if you're looking at, if it's a whole life policy, maybe that you're going to keep, and maybe kind of, again, you might be able to lock in some kind of preferred rates, or maybe allow to increase coverage and change kind of the terms down the road without a need to reevaluate whether your child is still insurable. I mean, that is a type of rider that you can have on certain policies. So even if your child later on in life develops some certain medical conditions that may deem them uninsurable, so they may not be able to get life insurance, or if they can, it's going to be really gosh darn expensive. To already have this type of policy in place, again, that you've turned over to them, and that now they have it, is again maybe a really wonderful gift that you can provide them in terms of providing stability and financial security for them and their family down the road. So all things to really think about. And the last big issue I want to point out too is so far I focused on things to be done really in regards at your child's level, having your child sign over a power of attorney or a healthcare directive or a HIPAA waiver, or you're getting a life insurance policy that maybe if all goes well, you turn over to your kid and it's going to be theirs at some point down the road. But also don't forget that your kids turning 18 might have an impact on your estate plan. A lot of people who set up wills and trusts and all of these other different estate planning documents years ago, maybe you did when the kids were little, saying, I just want something in place. I want to make sure we appoint a guardian for the kids. I want to make sure maybe their inheritance is looked after. Well, now that your child is a legal adult, one, you don't need to appoint a guardian anymore because they're over the age of 18, but also, so maybe you just want to take a look at your documents and say, hey, can we simplify things and kind of do away with all this extra stuff we thought we needed when the kids were little? So maybe it might mean you can take a lot of those more complicated provisions out and say, things are simpler now, the kids are older, we don't need this. Alternatively, you might say, well, we kind of kept things simple when the kids were younger. We set up a will and said, everything to the kids outright equal shares. But now we have a better sense of who our kids are. They're 18 now, and we see exactly how responsible or not responsible they are. God, if something happens to us tomorrow and they inherit all of our assets, how comfortable do we feel with that? And if the answer is not much, maybe instead of simplifying your plan, you're still going back, revisiting and revising your plan, but maybe you're putting different provisions in place to say, well, maybe we do want to trust now that we know our kid's 18, and probably, again, if they're not financially mature enough to handle an inheritance, maybe we want to put some type of trust in place. We want to make sure somebody's going to be looking over their shoulder and making sure this inheritance is managed appropriately. So it's really going to be there to last. So again, as your kids get older, it should prompt you to look at your own estate plan and go, do these provisions that we put in place maybe years and years ago need to be changed? Also, to something that happens pretty commonly as kids get older, and maybe not necessarily right as your kids turn 18, but something to keep in mind as they now become adults in the eyes of the rest of the world, is if you have previous estate planning documents where you appointed, something I see that's really common, particularly with folks with younger kids, is if you're picking who's going to be your executor and your power of attorney, a lot of times it's spouse. But then when we look at, well, who did you name as an alternate in case your spouse couldn't do it? A lot of times it's siblings, or it's your parents, or maybe close family friends. But maybe now that the kids are older, maybe it should be your kids that are your alternate executor or your alternate power of attorney. Those are the people that you really trust to be serving in these types of roles, particularly maybe when it comes down to making medical decisions. They're the closest people in the world to you. So maybe you want them making those decisions and not your parents anymore, who might be aging and kind of not able to handle those types of responsibilities. So again, just take it as a time to not only think about the considerations that you're going to be facing in regards to your child's situation and access to their information, but you should also be considering how it's going to impact your own plan. So kind of having said all of that, that is all really the information that I wanted to provide to you today. If anybody does have any extra questions or maybe something specific as to their own plan or concerns that they're seeing with their family, please feel free to type it into the chat here. I'm happy to answer that for you. Otherwise, if you have something that you maybe don't necessarily want to discuss in front of everybody on our call today, you can also contact me directly via email or give me a call. I'm happy to answer your specific questions that way as well. So please visit our website, kkc-law.com. That's going to have all of my contact information there. And again, I'd be happy to walk through any specific questions that anybody might have. Also too, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, and I'm just going to reiterate to you today, is we do have our next webinar that we're going to be having in our Wednesday webinar series is December 8th. And that's going to be on estate planning tips in light of year end. So maybe some things that merit cleaning up before the end of the year. So keep a lookout for that, and please sign up if you feel it's going to be beneficial for you to get that information. I don't see anybody typing any questions in, so I'll take that as we can wrap up the webinar for today. Again, thank you to everybody for attending. Don't hesitate to reach out if you do have any questions. And also too, if you wanted to review some of the material that I discussed today, all of our webinars are recorded and posted on our YouTube channel, so please feel free to rewatch the recording there. So thank you, and I hope everybody has a nice day.